Good evening, good morning from Uganda, actually. So it's good evening from Uganda. Welcome to the first webinar on understanding biotechnologies and a global overview. I will hand over the moderation to Sabrina. Sabrina, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from wherever you're joining. And welcome and thank you for registering for this webinar on understanding biodigital technologies, a global overview, which will be facilitated by Jim Thomas from Scan the Horizon. I'm Sabrina Masinjila, the Program Officer on Agroecology, Food Sovereignty and Justice at the Society for International Development, and I'm based in Tanzania, and I will be the moderator for this webinar today. Now, before I introduce Jim, I would like to just give a bit of a brief background to these webinars. Now, Barbara has mentioned that this is the first webinar. It's part one of a series of webinars that are being conducted in preparation to the upcoming Pan-African meeting on biodigital technologies scheduled to take place in Addis Ababa, October this year. Now, this will be the first ever Pan-African meeting organized by the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa and the African Technology Assessment Platform, AfriTAP, bringing together civil society groups, social movements, independent scientists, lawyers, among others, who are working together to track, understand, and assess the implications of new and emerging technologies in Africa. The details and dates of these webinars, the next webinars following this one, will be shared with you in due course after the conclusion of this webinar. So please stay tuned for this and make sure that you save the dates. Now, the objectives of the webinar of these webinars is to build understanding and knowledge to civil society, media, social movements on what these emerging digital technologies are, biodigital technologies are, and what the implications are for Africa. Now, in particular topics ranging from global trends on biodigital, how these are shaping and reshaping food systems, unpacking the landscape of biodigital technologies in Africa, grassroots innovations for Africa, and participatory technology assessment, among others, will be discussed. So just giving you a bit of background on what to expect during the course of this series of webinars. Now, just a few ground rules for this meeting. I see everyone has muted their mic. Please continue to do so if you're not speaking, to prevent any disruptions and interruptions to the meeting. Please continue to introduce yourself in the chat, your organization, where you are based, so that we can get to know each other. This webinar is scheduled for 1.5 hours. Our facilitator will speak for at least half an hour or more, and later we will open the floor for any comments and discussions. But in the meantime, during the presentations, please feel free to write comments, questions in the chat, and we will read them after the presentation. There is interpretation in English and French, so please choose the language that you will be listening in this webinar. And the meeting is also being recorded, and this will be shared after this meeting. Now, without further ado, I would like now to introduce you to our speaker for today, Jim Thomas. Jim is based in Canada. He is a writer, a researcher, and activist tracking emerging technologies, corporate power, biodiversity, and food systems. Formerly part of ETC Group, he is now a freelance researcher working with several civil society networks, including in Africa. He is also an AI Market and Power Fellow with European AI and Society Fund, investigating how artificial intelligence companies are using the immense power, wealth, and digital tools to transform areas such as genetic engineering, food and farming, mining, among others. Now, Jim is going to take a critical deep dive on food, power, and the future. What's really shaping our food systems, where biodigital technologies are rapidly transforming agriculture, who's controlling them, and what are the risks for food sovereignty. Thank you, and over to you, Jim. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. I'm going to just have a presentation, so I'm going to see if I can share that. Is that visible to everyone?
Would you mind coming closer, Jim? A bit closer to the microphone for better interpretation, Jim?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks very much. Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Sabrina and Barbara. Thanks for the opportunity to give this presentation. It's always a complete pleasure to work with AFSA and with Etc. Group and with AfriTaps. They're such important networks who are doing such essential work, not just on the continent, but around the world. So I really appreciate the honor of being able to talk in this webinar series. I'm taking my task here today as just sort of opening up this webinar series towards the meeting that's going to be happening in Addis Ababa in early October, which will be around this theme of biodigital technologies. And so I'm going to give remarks in a very general way about what we mean by biodigital. What is that? And the sort of issues that arise from this coming together of digital technologies with the biological world, which is really what we're talking about. I think our movements, many of those who are on the call today, are familiar with biotechnology, with genetic engineering and the fight against GMOs, which has been such an important fight, including on the continent, and the ways in which those technologies, biotechnologies, have affected the rights of farmers, have raised issues around safety, around corporate power, and so on. But probably our movements are less familiar, that the movements who connect with AFSA and AfriTap and so on are less familiar with the equally significant fights around digital justice and digital rights that have been going on for some time and are now very much merging with other struggles around water and food and health and so on. I wanted to start really with this term digitalization, which is a term that groups like AFSA, Etc. Group, Grain, and others are now beginning to talk about in the context of the food system. And when we say something is digitized, we mean that it's being turned into data. And data is machine readable information, the ones and zeros. The digits that we're talking about are the ones and zeros of computer code. As you'll know, computers run on this very simple binary language, 1001111. And what computing has done over the past 40, 50 years is take things that previously were analog, such as sound and text and music and vision and images, and turned it into a digital format that can be read by computers, these ones and zeros. And that's, we're familiar with that in the world of digitizing images, digitizing sound, digitizing text, but it's now moving on to also digitally representing things like soil, the parts of our life, whether that's our health data, our genes, our blood, our heartbeat. It can all be represented digitally. And of course, our behaviors, which is what social media in particular is doing, representing us as human beings in these digital ways. And our brainwaves as well are also being captured and represented digitally. So we're seeing this move to try and capture parts of life as digital representations. This is basically what digitalization is. Digitalization, you can also see as a sort of advance of the computer industry, if you like, or the information tech industry, and that there have been these different phases in the growth of the digital computer industry that are each being dominated by different increasingly powerful corporations. That if we go back 60 years or so, 70 years, computing was really dealing with numbers. And so you have companies like IBM, International Business Machines, with these large mainframe computers that you see on the left, who were the powerful players and were supporting certain types of engineering or the military. Through the 1980s and to the 1990s, we saw the rise of the personal computer and beginning of the digitization of sound, of games, and so on. And so there we saw companies like Apple and Microsoft become very significant. And then with the rise of the internet through the 90s and the early 2000s, we saw the digitization wave and the corporate digitization wave really move online with these large companies such as Facebook, now called Meta, or Google, for example, and into companies like eBay, M-Pesa, and others who are also allowing trading through this digital platform of money and goods. And now we're into another phase of digitization where artificial intelligence is really driving the power, and so we're seeing a wave of exceedingly powerful digital AI companies that I'll come to at the end of this presentation. And of course, out of that digital transformations and revolution, we've seen many social issues and environmental issues arise. You'll be familiar with the way in which digital platforms in particular, such as Facebook, Instagram, and so forth, have led to dictators and authoritarian governments creating fake news and trying to manipulate populations, that this has allowed widespread surveillance of populations and how that's used by both companies and governments. And of course, this whole digital infrastructure involves tremendous amounts of waste, of e-waste, with poisons and pollution and of course all the mining and so forth that's associated with that. And those are very real impacts of the digitalization we've seen so far, as well as the sort of psychological impacts of particularly young people, but people more generally being in different ways addicted to these digital products or in many ways controlled or impacted by digitalization. And one thing that's been very clear is that it's given rise to incredibly powerful companies, incredibly powerful monopolies, in fact, that the underlying resource that runs this industry, this digital industry, is data. It's that stuff that was taken from life, turned into data, and then stored. That's sort of the oil, if you like. It's often called the new oil. Data is the new oil, we hear. That builds incredible wealth and power for companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft. These are now not just the wealthiest companies in the world. They're each worth at least 2 trillion, 3 trillion, and one or two of them, Nvidia and Microsoft, may be about to become $4 trillion companies. But they really have a reach across the economy that's unknown, and they're probably the most powerful companies in at least 150 years, if not more so than the big oil companies like Standard Oil. And at this point, you might be saying, well, this is all true, but what does this mean for food and farming and the living world where we as movements spend our time paying attention? Because it seems like these digital powers, while important and while having real effects, may not really affect the food system. But what we're seeing and have seen in the last few years is that these digital titans like Microsoft, Google, and others, with their massive wealth and capital, are trying to enter other markets. They're trying to make themselves central, not just to media and software and things like that, but to become the key players in health, in food, in mining and other parts of the economy. Health is one example. The ability to turn different aspects of ourselves, whether it's our brain waves or our blood or our DNA, into data, and to build a health system around data is a massive, massive financial opportunities for these companies. And so they're pushing for us all to become digitized and for health to become a digital matter. And likewise with food. The food system sells about $15 trillion of goods every year, just food goods. In fact, it's more than that if you add timber and textiles and so forth. And all the way through the so-called food chain, the industrial food chain, you can see many types of data that are being produced, whether that's soil data or the DNA that is in the crops that we're breeding and the animals that we're breeding. Of course, there's the data about trading commodities across oceans and the data about how people buy food and consume food. And all of that data is an amazing commercial opportunity for these data companies. And they would like the food production system to be more about data and for them to be the ones who are the middlemen, if you like, in how food is produced. They see this as a huge commercial opportunity all the way from the seed to our stomach. And just to notice, the other place where there's incredible amount of data and the companies are really trying to get in on is biodiversity. That whether it's weather data, the genomic data of wild species and plants, the soil data, the data about how many different species are in a particular square kilometer of forest, the sounds of animals, all of this biodiversity data. If you can make conservation be about data, it puts these companies like Google, like Meta, like Microsoft at the very heart of how we supposedly conserve our planet. So they also see that as a massive opportunity for them. And that links in, of course, to food, because food, as we know, depends upon biodiversity. And so we're increasingly seeing that this world of the digital stuff, which moved from numbers to sound and pictures, is now moving into digitizing the biological as well. That biological things are being represented as data, and that data is being used to control biological things. And that the divide is either disappearing or it's becoming very entangled. This idea of the biodigital, where you're both dealing with the biological world of food, of land, of people, of health, of life, and you're dealing with the digital world of data and of computers, is becoming increasingly the same thing. In many ways, what digitization allows is that things in the real world, biological things, can be more closely tracked. Companies or governments can more precisely sort of track where they are. But they also become more tractable, by which I mean more manipulatable, more able to manipulate them. And that once you can track something and describe something as data, you can then find new ways to manipulate it. And this is kind of the heart of biodigital theory, if you like. In the digital world, you have an idea that's known as digital twins. Sometimes they're called digital voodoo dolls. And this is the way in which a company like Facebook or Google will collect as much data as they possibly can on you as an individual. And they'll make a digital model of you, which shows all the things you like, all the things that move you, your financial history and so forth. And by having all this information about you, they can then work out how to present you with something that's going to move you, you're going to respond to. In a way that this digital model of you is a way to be able to manipulate you in the real world. And that's really the sort of theory of control, of moving things between the real world and a digital model. The theory is, if you can make a detailed digital model, or you can seem to make a detailed digital model, and you can manipulate that in the digital world, then it shows you how you can manipulate it in the real world, or you can turn it back into the real thing and set it out in the real world. That's the kind of biodigital shift that companies are trying to do. I'll give some examples. So DNA, as many of you will know, is the sort of coding protein rather, that's in most living things. And it's seen as, which isn't quite right, but it's sort of seen as the instructions for how organisms grow, how they reproduce, how they pass on different traits. And in genetic engineering, of course, biotech companies have been trying to change those instructions. Well, DNA, for many years, you've been able to read it as a code. The code is 4 letters, G, T, C, and A. Those are the 4 base pairs of a DNA strand. And of course, you can record those digitally. Recording them digitally is known as digital sequence information. And so we have huge databases now where living organisms are sequenced. That's to say they go through a machine that turns that DNA code into a digital code. It's then possible to remake the digital code back into an actual DNA sequence. You have a machine called a DNA synthesizer, and it builds DNA as a chemical, and it builds it according to the code you want. So if you want a piece of DNA that goes G, T, T, C, A, T, G, G, it will build that. And so once it's a digital thing, once DNA is a digital thing, you can then manipulate it digitally. You can redesign the DNA. You can try and work out how you would have DNA that changes the color of eyes or the way in which something grows. And so DNA becomes this biodigital thing. It moves between the biological to the digital and back to the biological. And so now all the new genetic engineering that we're seeing, the area of so-called synthetic biology, is biodigital. It's based not on taking the sequence, the actual cuttings or the samples from biology, but rather turning those samples into digital code, redesigning in the digital world, and then turning them back into living organisms, viruses, bacteria, and sequences of protein. And that's certainly how the so-called gene editing process is working. So we now have genetic engineering, this manipulation of life at a very basic level is biodigital. Many on this call will be familiar with the idea of digital farming. Digital farming is basically where tech companies, but also large agribusiness companies like Bayer, that was Monsanto, are taking as much data from the soil, from the crops, from the weather as possible, and they're putting that into a large model, and then giving predictions or prescriptions to farmers about where they should spray or which seeds they should use or how they should design their farms. This is for industrial agriculture. And increasingly, the actual farming is being done by machines that are directed by these predictive models, these digital models. And so farming too, the landscape of farming, particularly industrial farming in places like North America, is being decided by machines. It's being decided by digital decisions. In that sense, the biological world of farming is becoming biodigital. The landscape is directed that way. Sometimes this goes extremely far. So we have a company by the name of Innerplant, again, based in North America, who have genetically engineered corn and soybeans, in this example, soybeans, so that when those soybeans are stressed and don't have enough water, they glow. They glow, but the only way you can see that glow is with a particular machine vision mounted onto a tractor. Those have been genetically engineered. The actual engineering itself was biodigital. They did it in a digital environment. Then they made the soybeans. But then the soybeans, when they put out the signal, can only be seen by a machine. And when it sees that they're stressed, then the machine sprays water. So in this way, there is an entanglement between the biological design and the digital design. This whole system only works when genetic engineering and digital design are brought together. So it's a very biodigital system. I hope that makes sense. Where we previously had what we called Roundup ready crops, where the crops were designed to work alongside pesticides. Now we have robot ready crops, where the crops are designed to work with robots. Another example of this sort of biodigital interface is the way in which at the consumer end, more and more information about us and our behaviors and our diets and what we like is being collected by large companies such as Nestle and Unilever and grocery stores. And they're using this data about us and our food preferences to try and push us to buy things. They understand that there are times in the day, for example, when we are more hungry, or we may have a particular thing that we want to eat. They might be tracking, for example, our stress levels through our phones, or tracking menstruation, for example, over a month. And then at the right moment, they'll push messages to say, why don't you go and buy a hamburger, or get a delivery, or have money off at the grocery store. In this sense, the digital is again interacting with the food system in a way that's kind of biodigital. So it's just another example of this biodigital coming together. And we can see throughout the food chain, the industrial food chain, that the digitization, the use of digital tools goes all the way from designing seeds and crops, all the way through to whether on the field through digital farming, or trying to control animal production digitally, the trading of food and the design of food through ultra-processed foods, right through to that kind of delivery and nudging of our food desires. So the whole food system is becoming a kind of playground for digital companies. Another way in which we can think about the biodigital is the way that this digital world is really pushing on and beginning to hurt the biological world. That for many years, we've been sort of told that the digital, whether we're using social media platforms or whatever, is in the cloud. It's kind of virtual and doesn't exist out there. We don't have to think about it very much. And that's far from true. The so-called cloud is in fact extremely large data centers full of thousands upon thousands of computers using massive amounts of energy and water, and built out of minerals and concrete and glass and plastic. There's nothing weightless about the cloud. In fact, it has an incredible weight to it, and that weight is now hitting biological reality. A writer called Benjamin Bratton a few years ago talked about the completeness of all the different parts of the internet, computers, the data system, the networks should be seen as one common machine. And that when you do, you realize it's the largest accidental megastructure that humanity has ever built. That the internet and everything that hangs off of it is more significant in size and weight than the railways and the road system and so forth. It really is an incredibly large, complex physical thing. And often we just see the thing in front of us. We see the cell phone, and that's almost like looking at the mushroom that sticks up out of the ground without realizing the massive web that's under the earth that makes the mushroom possible. In the late 1990s, industry was laying cables, the cables for carrying the internet, at a rate of 350 meters per second, which was the speed of sound. This was the largest build out of any infrastructure since the railways at the end of the 19th century. By 2018, that laying of cable was going at 50 times the speed of sound. This machine, this mega machine, has been growing incredibly fast, and is in fact speeding up now. And we have to start reckoning with this mega machine of digital infrastructure. We have about 20 billion connected devices to this mega machine, 127 new devices every second. And building the minerals we require for building this, and the computer that you're looking at, and the machines that are in the data centers, means that the amount of minerals we need, the projected increase is up to 3,000 times more between 2020 to 2040. We're about to speed up the extraction of cobalt, of nickel, of tin, all of which, of course, involves very direct impacts on biodiversity, but very direct impacts on people and communities, especially on the African continent, which is where cobalt, for example, comes from, and many of these key minerals, lithium as well. And at the other end of the production, the disposal of electronics, so-called e-waste, with all the pollution. Africa, again, is very much at the heart of that. It's where much of the world's e-waste ends up. So the continent where many of you are is the continent that's most affected. It used to be that the production of chips for computers came to about 4 silicon wafers per second being produced globally. This is now very out of date. But when it was that, you could see that every second we were getting thousands, tens of thousands of cubic feet of gases, hazardous gases, massive amounts of water, huge amounts of electrical power and chemicals, all just to produce just the chips. And now with artificial intelligence, that has actually increased exponentially. And the chips now, many of them, even when they're produced, are thrown away because they have to be such high quality to be used. And perhaps most importantly is the amount of energy that all this requires. When we talk about data and everything being turned into data, we sometimes forget that data is also not weightless. It is actually energy. Data is actually the movement of energy between computers or stored on computers. And it's not just energy, all that energy requires water. Almost all the production of electricity, whether it's through fossil fuels or nuclear power or hydroelectric, also requires tremendous amounts of energy, as well as to cool down those very energy intensive computers. At the moment, we have about 181 zettabytes of digital data worldwide. That's really impossible to fathom how much data that is. But even most interesting, 90% of that was produced in just the last 2 years. And the amount of data that we have is doubling every 4 years. So the way in which this digital infrastructure is consuming not just material, but energy is entirely out of control. And we need the energy to collect the data, to turn it into digital data, to store it. There are vast amounts of data that's called dark data that's stored and never used. For example, all the data that's coming off of surveillance cameras, never even looked at, to do computation, to send, to receive. And this comes back to some of these uses in food and agriculture. I did a little calculation. If you look at the leading digital farming platform called Climate Field View from Bayer, just to transmit the data from the fields to Bayer's computers uses 28 terawatt hours of electricity every year. That's double the energy use of Kenya. But that's just to transmit the data. To then compute it and store it and so forth is a whole other use of data. So as we move into a world where these companies are trying to use digital farming and turning farming into a digital activity, what they're doing is they're adding whole countries' worth of electricity to the farming enterprise, which was never needed. And of course, mostly as fossil fuel. And behind that, you have these data centers. This is a data center in Nairobi, the IX Africa data center. This is where the actual digitalization, the digits, if you like, are kept and computing happens. It used to be that you met, and these buildings are full of computers that are running so hot that they have to be cooled down with fresh water all day long. It used to be that you measured data centers in the size of football fields. Today, you measure data centers the size of campuses. They call them campuses, like university campuses. And they're getting larger and larger, what are known as hyperscale data centers. There are around 10,000 data centers globally, but we're seeing a massive build out of data centers across all parts of the planet, including in Africa. The US is the largest place for data centers, but Africa is an extremely important target for these data centers. They require land, they require electricity, huge amounts of electricity. They require huge amounts of water, and it has to be fresh water to cool down the computers. And that fresh water is increasingly being taken away from farming and from communities. In Lagos, for example, some of the poorest communities no longer have access to fresh water because it's being redirected towards data centers, and they're having to buy more and more expensive and inaccessible bottled water. So this is a direct threat to communities and to farming. And what we're beginning to see here is a pattern that's not unfamiliar to people in the global south, which is that large companies like Google, like Facebook, Meta, are using the south as a place where they can grab data, where they can grab the underlying resources, whether that's energy or minerals or water, in order to run this huge infrastructure that will deliver them enormous profits, the largest profits that we've ever seen in history. And this is often referred to as data colonialism. And there's a whole network of scholars who are now working on this question of data colonialism. And in Africa, we see this really happening with the data centers that are now being built up. Interestingly, one of the reasons why Africa is a good place for building data centers and for data infrastructure is because there are undersea cables that come to Africa, and they land in about 37 countries at exactly the same places where the slave trade used to go out of. It's interesting that the roots of these cables are exactly the same as the roots of the slave trade. The same colonial patterns that took human bodies are now taking data and energy and water out to these companies. And what's really driving this now is this next phase of so-called artificial intelligence. And so I was going to spend just a couple of minutes before we finish talking about artificial intelligence. Many of you will know about artificial intelligence or have familiarity with using things like ChatGPT. The important thing about artificial intelligence is that while it is artificial, it's really not intelligent. The idea that artificial intelligence is something like machine intelligence or thinking machines or computer sentience is very much a product of science fiction that's intentionally sold to get hype and money for this industry. That term originally was a marketing term from 1956. What artificial intelligence is software and systems that can predict probabilities. The probability, for example, and I'll go through this here with generative AI, of what the next word will be. So if you're familiar with ChatGPT, which is an example of what's called generative AI, all that's happening there is it has an incredible amount of data that it has access to through a model. And it looks at that model and it tries to predict what is the next word that it might say that would please you as the user. It's rather like predictive text on your phone, where you start to type something and it tries to predict how to finish the word. In the case of ChatGPT, you ask it a question and it tries to predict what series of words would make you happy, basically. And in order to do that, it has to train its model on the entire internet's worth of data. And that's why it's becoming incredibly energy and resource intensive. And the same is done with images. When you see AI image production like DALL-E or Midjourney, all it's doing is taking this incredible amount of data that's been fed into it and trying to patch it together through guessing how you would like to see it, really. As a result of which, you end up with all kinds of errors because that guessing is often wrong. It's incomplete. You get pictures like this one here, where it looks good when you first look at it, and then you see the person has a horn going through their head or 6 fingers. And actually, this isn't an error. This is built into how artificial intelligence works. About a third of AI-produced content is wrong. It's either factually wrong or it's wrong in terms of image. It's what is sometimes called hallucinations. And you also get a tremendous amount of bias, particularly racial bias, gender bias, because what it's trained on includes all these biases and it reproduces them. And ultimately, nobody can really tell why it's coming up with these results. It's what we call a black box. But underlying that is this massive amount of data. The companies like OpenAI or Google who are building these AI systems are having to scrape all of the data off the internet, all of the data out of libraries, and they're now trying to take data from as many places as they possibly can, from social media, for example. There's an incredibly good book by Karen Howe that just came out called Empire of AI, which looks at the way in which how the AI industry really is imperial. It really is colonial and goes to the places where the AI industry is affecting most, places like Kenya or Colombia, and how on the ground, because of the extraction of minerals and the effects on workers, this industry is really extracting incredible amounts from people and communities. Most importantly, AI is extracting from workers, particularly in Africa. In order to train those models, they're not automatic. You need to have rooms and rooms and rooms of very low-paid workers who are looking at the data and cleaning the data or choosing things so that they're teaching the model. And those, for example, in Kenya, OpenAI used Sama Source in Nairobi. They were exposed to all kinds of nasty sexual and violent content so that the model wouldn't produce nasty sexual and violent content. But those workers then had all kinds of psychological problems, breakdowns in their relationships, health problems as a result of training the models. And that's happening all over the world. It's workers who are being exploited, usually in the very most vulnerable countries. And AI itself isn't just generating text and pictures and sound and video. It's now moving on to creating life forms. Just as you can say to ChatGPT, write me a poem about a dog, and it write you a poem about a dog, or draw me a dog, and it draws you a dog. Now, we have AI programs where you can say, design me a protein, like stevia, or a alternative to soy, and it will design that protein, that genetic protein. Or you could say, design me a virus, or design me a bacteria. And so genetic engineering, the genetic design using DNA as digital sequence information, is now happening within artificial intelligence. Rather than producing English, it's producing living organisms. This has obviously issues. You can produce viruses that are pretty nasty. There's much worry about how you can use AI to make bioweapons, for example, or toxins. But for communities, it raises a whole new set of concerns. The first AI ingredient that's on the market is produced by a company called Azeda. And they've used artificial intelligence to design a version of stevia as a sweetener. And that stevia competes directly with the natural grown stevia grown in Kenya, for example, and other places in East Africa, which are now the leading countries for stevia. So you're seeing a direct threat to the natural products from Africa and elsewhere. A lot of this work is focused on trying to make alternatives to meat, proteins for things like the Impossible Burger. And so that's then has serious questions about putting control over the food system in these tech companies who are making ultra processed foods, alternative proteins and so forth. And what we're now seeing, because you can use artificial intelligence to design life forms and to design proteins, is the very largest tech companies like Microsoft, Google, NVIDIA, Meta, Salesforce, coming into the food, agriculture, and genetic engineering space. And where we've had to deal before with big agribusiness companies or big biotech companies, We're now going to have to deal with big data companies, and they are the wealthiest and most powerful companies in the world. And they're not just trying to create proteins, they're also trying to create crops. There are now AI programs where you can generate new crop varieties. And these crops can be generated, although they would be genetically engineered when you turn them back into the real thing, they can be designed to evade national regulation. For example, the European Union now has new regulation coming in saying that if an engineered crop has less than 20 changes in the DNA, it's not considered genetically engineered anymore, and it's no longer regulated. And using AI, you can now design crops with less than 20 changes. And so the European Union, which used to have the strongest GMO legislation, has suddenly jumped to having the worst GMO regulation because of the effect of these AI bots. Underlying all of this, there needs to be incredible amounts of data. That in order for an AI system to genetically engineer a virus or a crop, they need to have massive amounts of digital genetic information. And so we have companies like Basecamp Research who are now making partnerships with communities across Africa and with governments to try and take as much soil samples and samples of crops and water samples so they can sequence them and get as much DNA as they possibly can. And here we have an example of Basecamp working with the government of Cameroon. I'm going to stop there because I've covered many things, but hopefully it gives a bit of a sense of how this digital and biological world is coming together. There's on the last thing I was talking about there, the genetic engineering through artificial intelligence, there is a report, go back here, by the African Center for Biodiversity called Black Box Biotech that describes that. And you can also look at my own website, Scan the Horizon, and I put some information there. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Jim. I don't know how everyone else is feeling, but I'm kind of scared, angry. All those emotions just came through me when I was listening to your presentation. But thank you so much for such a powerful and enlightening. I think I've learned so much from your presentation, and I'm sure there are lots and lots of questions, comments that people are actually thinking. People are not writing, but I know people are questioning and thinking about this. I would like to open the floor because I think Jim has taken us through the whole landscape from what this digitalization is, data, what this data is being used for, where it is being sourced, the new age of AI and what it's doing, the implications to workers, communities, land, resources, biodiversity, farming, the future of farming actually. So I would like to open the floor. There have been some 2 or 3 questions that came through. So let me try and read them. There was one question before you even began your presentation about technologies. So Paul from the Tanzania Organic Agriculture Movement was questioning whether you'd capture the technologies in Africa, which are new, particularly those that are being used to like mosquito gene drives and stuff. So you can imagine, Jim, we're also still grappling with the gene drive technologies, which are still done in the lab, but now we have to face this threat about digitalization and how data is being used to develop even new species. So maybe if you can answer that, because I think for some of us, we're still grappling with the old, I would call them now old ways of genetic engineering, and now towards this new age of genetic engineering using AI. So that's question 1. And then there's a question from Shmuel. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. how biodigital technologies can support effective struggle against poverty and improvement of socio-economic well-being of low socioeconomic groups of population. So probably also answer to this, because there are spaces where you will go and people will be like, but AI is good, we use AI. And so people are grappling between the positive aspects of digitalization technologies, but also balancing between what are the risks, the potential risks and the harms and the challenges. So I'll leave you to answer those two questions and then we can move along. Thank you.
Yeah, so as I said at the beginning, I was trying to sort of talk on a more high level about what this biodigital convergence is. So I realized I didn't go into many specific technologies, although I touched on some. But I do think, for example, although it's true that movements are still very much trying to understand and deal with and respond to the first generation of genetically engineered crops, for example, and that's a real threat. Even pesticides, things that have been around for a long time. Some of these newer developments, like gene drives, are biodigital, actually. The reason that it's possible to create gene drives, that is, organisms that will intentionally spread through a population, whether that's mosquitoes or flies or something, is because the companies are able to design them on a computer and then use gene editing. That they've been able to use the power of the digital, if you like, to design these kind of crazy new species. So in fact, the fight against gene drives is a biodigital fight in that sense. And you can see very much how it plays out on the ground in communities where these are now being tested. And of course, that's unfortunately often the case, is that when you have these risky and unusual new technologies, they get tested out in places like the African continent as guinea pigs. To the question of are there biodigital technologies that can help and fight against poverty and improving economic situations? I personally think no. It's always possible to look at one of the tricks the tech industry constantly plays is they say this is about the individual. It's about your power as an individual to use our technology to improve your lot, to compete better, to understand things better, to improve your personal education and so forth. And they hide away the collective impacts of their technology, and of course, who has the most power in all of this are the companies. It's the tech companies, and behind them, certain countries. What's happening in artificial intelligence, but also in genetic engineering, is a massive geopolitical fight between Europe and China to try and build up their industries. All of these technologies, whether it's something like CRISPR and the biotechnologies, and certainly artificial intelligence, can only exist with massive amounts of resources. The so-called generative AI requires ever bigger and ever larger data centers with ever more high energy computers computing ever more data. And so it's a winner takes all situation. Whoever has the most computers, whoever has the most energy and water and minerals wins. And they use this technology against everybody else to improve their position. Unfortunately, that's the truth. And that's why we're seeing so much money in the trillions of dollars going into these huge companies, because they're basically positioning themselves as the winners, as the masters. Can an African country or an African community or African companies compete in that? No, absolutely not. Not a chance. They can hook their interests to one of these large companies. They can sell data. They could be part of mining, things that support these companies, but they'll never have agency in that situation. This is a highly imperial, highly colonial technology. And I think that just makes it inappropriate for it to be a way of doing development, in my view.
Thank you so much, Jim, for those responses. So I'm gonna break and take a hand from Leonida, and then I'll read the other questions. So Leonida, can you please go ahead and ask a question?
Thank you, Sabrina, and good evening, everyone. Given the enormity of the situation, particularly for Africa, and the fact that Africa is the richest continent, when you talk about natural resources, for example, coltan that powers all mobile phones is found in the Democratic Republic of Congo. What is that one advice that you could give to Africa as a continent to counter this, given that it's a very dire situation, it's very scary, and it's about resource grabs? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, Africa is extremely rich in minerals, in data, in people, and often the way in which the tech industry will talk, they'll talk about Africa as a data-rich country because it has many people who are online and producing data, and as you say, and a lot of biodiversity, a lot of land, water, which they urgently need. And the potential for energy, sunlight, for example, also trying to set up nuclear energy and fossil fuel energy. So these industries sees Africa as somewhere that will provide them with the resources that they need. I think it's instructive to look at how other regions are responding. So Europe, for example, is being left behind in this fight between North America, between the US and China. And what they're trying to do is to create what they would call technological sovereignty. They're saying, can we have our own digital sovereignty where we have European institutions, European laws, European companies, and that we focus more on public good rather than private profit. And there's the beginning of that happening. They're calling it the Europe stack. I think there's discussions in Africa about the Africa stack. I think I've heard that before. Others might know more about that. So trying to say, what would African digital sovereignty look like? How do we ensure that it's not just large companies like Google and Facebook and Meta coming in, taking our energy, taking our data, taking our people's labor, and using it to support basically American and Chinese development. So there is this idea of digital sovereignty, but then how that relates to community sovereignty, food sovereignty, I think is a really important discussion to have, and that's something that the African food sovereignty movement should lead the discussion on. Yeah, so I think there's a really important discussion to have there.
Great. Thank you, Leonida, for that and the response. I think what you're saying about digital sovereignty, there was also a comment from the Prime Minister of Barbados the other day, and she was saying we need to have our own sovereignty because for example, we cannot have, for example, technology such as Starlink set in our countries, collecting our own data and using that data against us. So I think it has to come to a point where we start having those discussions, but also what you've said in terms of relating it to food sovereignty is another level of discussion that we need to start having, particularly on the African continent. So I'm going to read a few more questions that have been pasted in the chat. One of the question is, what is the effect what effect does this have on organic farming? This was coming from Mwikamba. And I guess this is also related to, for example, when you mentioned about plant breeding and the development of plant varieties, and this whole question around where the EU is now saying we are not going to regulate where changes have less than 20 have been done on an organism, which is quite ridiculous. So what would be the impact of organic farming, but I think also agroecological farming, where, you know, we as movements are trying to push for. Then there's another question from Maya. So she says, with the intense resource use and all the social ecological consequences of extraction, digital tech and the cloud, do you think it is possible to build digital tools to support smallholder farming? And the third question, and then you can answer, as AI is clearly the future of global economy, regulation is off the table as companies and countries compete for a piece of the action. Can we encourage countries to regulate this before it's too late? That's the question coming from Michael Farrelly.
Yeah, so on the question of organic and agroecological implications, I think there's at least two different ways. I think the organic movement and agroecological movements can think about this. One is to think about the ways in which, as these technologies come into, as you say, breeding, so the use of AI for breeding CRISPR or for making microbes that will be put in the soil. That's something that's coming. So you use AI to design genetically engineered microbes for the soil. Or creating sprays, which is something I didn't talk about, but DNA sprays that will be sprayed. These are all things that certainly the organic movement needs to know are coming, in the same way that they knew GMOs were coming, and probably place barriers against those being part of organic production. So I think that's just about having good horizon scanning and being able to see this doesn't necessarily fit organic principles or agroecological principles, because it doesn't. There's a really big discussion in organic and agroecological circles around the use of digital farming. Does digital farming fit with organic production? And I think, or agroecological production, and I think a really important question there is that data, all the data that's required, all the energy, the minerals, the water required is an input. And in agroecological farming and organic farming, we try not to put artificial inputs. We try not to have external inputs, but to work within cycles. And to my view, adding data, adding electricity, because this is just electricity, to the farming process is basically adding an input the same as adding synthetic fertilizer or adding GMOs. And I think the organic movement especially should decide whether this is an input that is acceptable in organic agriculture, or whether it's too extractive. In agroecology, we have the key principles of agroecology, and a really important one of that is no extraction. And this is clearly a highly extractive input. So I think that's a discussion that urgently needs to be had amongst agroecologists and organic producers. The question, sorry, the second question was really important. I've just forgotten what it was.
With the intense resource use, do you think it's possible to build digital tools to support smallholder farming?
Yeah, so I think that kind of goes to the same question, actually. There's definitely work on trying to have small-scale digital tools that support farmers. This way in which, for example, artificial intelligence uses ever larger and larger models and larger amounts of data, that doesn't fit to my mind. But there is work on small models, small, carefully designed models. There are people who have small servers on their farm who are trying to set up systems where the data stays on the farm and doesn't go out and leave the farm, where there's very specific things, and so I think that requires technology assessment, that we look at those technologies and understand the bigger impacts. And I think that's one of the things that's going to be discussed in the meeting in Addis Ababa is how to have technology assessment. So yes, I think there may be a role for digital tools, but it has to be really carefully assessed. I don't think there's a role for generative artificial intelligence or large-scale artificial intelligence or biotech. And then this question about, with all these, are there things that can be done? The third question.
It was on regulation. As AI is clearly the future, regulation is off the table. Yeah.
So I actually wouldn't accept that AI is clearly the future. What AI is a massive investment by very wealthy companies who are trying to make money off of it right now. But you know, there are ways in which AI really doesn't work. As I said, there's always about a third of all AI production has errors. It's obviously massively energy and resource intensive, and at some point that's going to fall over. And also making things dependent on AI makes us incredibly fragile. So I think there's, just as we saw, you know, we would have heard from industrial agriculture proponents that industrial agriculture is the future, but it isn't. Most people still eat in traditional and agroecological ways. And in fact, organic and agroecological farming is coming back. There's nothing inevitable about AI as the future, and we shouldn't accept that inevitability. And for the sort of sovereignty and agency of African countries and communities and individuals, it may be better to develop the alternative. That's my view.
Oh, great. Yeah, I think also it's about the narrative. So if you say it's clearly the future, then what does that mean for movements and alternatives? Yeah, I think the other question was from Kedir. What are the benefits of using AI for agriculture? And I think you've sort of answered that, but maybe people are trying to see where does it fit in agriculture. How do we balance the increasing penetration rate of GMO seeds with the traditional grown seedlings to ensure sustainable biodiversity of local foods, especially in Africa? I think those are the remaining questions. Others are comments. So Maria Gross says, it appears as though developing safeguards to agricultural food systems might be difficult in the advent of generative AI. So I think this also links to the question Michael asked with regards to regulation. And also, yeah, okay. Yeah, I think that was the last comment I captured. Let me just check. Yeah, you can go ahead, I think.
Yeah, on the benefits of using AI, one thing I sort of skipped over is there isn't one type of AI. The kind of AI that we're seeing that uses ever more data and ever more energy is called generative AI. But there is what's sometimes called good old-fashioned AI or discriminative AI, which can use small models. And you know, that kind of AI is useful in doing things like tracking weather, understanding what's happening to weather patterns, understanding what's happening with biodiversity. It doesn't try to predict or propose new things. It just helps us understand. So I think, you know, there may be a role for carefully governed small-scale models of AI for, you know, weather, biodiversity monitoring and things. That there may be. The problem is how it's linked, very strongly linked, to this massive commercial imperative to gather as much data and try and produce as much money as possible. And that's what's happening now. I realized I didn't really answer the question around regulating. You know, as I think maybe it was Michael or somebody said, that the problem is that governments are being told that this is the future. They're being told that they have to get on the train or get sort of run over by it. And of course, you have the world's most wealthy and powerful companies who are doing what they can to try and stop AI being regulated and instead push governments to invest and give money for data centers. And so that's a real challenge. We just saw in the US, a law was almost passed. It got stopped at the last minute, which would have prevented any state in the US introducing legislation about artificial intelligence for 10 years. It was going to be a moratorium on AI laws for 10 years, and they almost got it. If they can do that in the US, it doesn't take much to pay for other countries to also be slow down any regulatory effort. And so, you know, it's going to be a big job to try and regulate this runaway powerful industry, for sure. And we have to start thinking how to do it. But I mean,
yeah, before you proceed, I think there are also other questions like Sikeli asked if there's a legal framework for biodigital technologies. So linked to that, yeah.
I mean, there are parts of it, right? So particularly around biotech, because of the work of movements, including people on this call, you know, there's a legal framework around GMOs, and that can apply to things that are developed through AI. The question of trying to, a really important part for the biotech-enabled stuff is you have to take lots of genetic data, and that's biopiracy. And there is an international framework to stop biopiracy, which is the Nagoya Protocol, the Kuala Lumpur Protocol of the Convention on Biodiversity. And so there is the potential for getting governments to say, if you're taking data that's genetic data, you're taking it from seeds and soil and so forth, then you have to agree benefits back to the community. It can't just go into a model. It has to pay back. So there is a fight to have there, and also to try and stop large amounts of genetic material being taken through biopiracy. With digital rights, there are digital rights frameworks to protect people's individual rights and privacy, but much of that is built around the first generation of digital tools like social media. Even there, it's not very good. And so trying to extend that out to think about collective rights over soil, over land, over water, is really an important step to take.
Great. Yeah, and then I think the other questions were, how do we balance the increasing penetration rate of GMO seeds with traditional grown seedlings to ensure sustainable biodiversity of local foods, especially in Africa? Yeah.
Yeah.
Or maybe also linked to that, I think
others in Africa will know better how to answer that.
Yes. And if anyone else wants to respond to that, feel free. So Michael Lege says South Sudan has a largely subsistence farming population. How might biodigital technologies impact traditional farming practices? And I think you've also alluded to this before. Like, how does biodigital technologies impact these traditional farming practices and indigenous seed systems? And then a question from Michael: how likely is it that AGI kills us all?
I mean, in terms of the question about subsistence production, obviously, one would hope if you have strong subsistence-based traditional farming that those farmers are continuing to use agroecological appropriate methods, and so, you know, hopefully that's a good guard against this, and protecting those traditional systems is really important. Obviously, what we're seeing is an industry that's trying to grab land and water and minerals. And so all of those grabs, those resource grabs, may definitely impact traditional farming systems. And that's something to watch out for. One thing I notice is that they like to have data centers in warm places because it helps evaporate the water into the air to help cool down the computers. South Sudan's pretty warm, so maybe that's something to watch out for. The question that Michael Farrelly asks is something I didn't touch on, but I think it's actually important to lift it up. The companies that are really pushing artificial intelligence, like OpenAI and Google and Elon Musk, for example, X, they push the idea that artificial intelligence is intelligence, and that it's really that the computers are getting so intelligent that it's going to become what's called artificial general intelligence or super intelligence. And that at some point their systems are going to be so smart that they may even become a threat to humanity, that they may be able to, you know, create wars or make super viruses and things like that. And you know, that's a science fiction story of artificial intelligence, that it becomes conscious and becomes like a living thing, and it's rubbish. It's not what artificial intelligence is. But that story is used to generate investment. the story of AGI, of artificial general intelligence, such that investors feel they have to get on the bandwagon. They have to be the ones making the money out of this. And companies like OpenAI, which is producer of ChatGPT, are saying the reason they're trying to get to artificial general intelligence, to the super intelligence before everybody else, that it's a race, is so that they can make sure that it's friendly AGI, that the artificial and general intelligence is safe and ethical, which is ridiculous. So I think these ideas that artificial intelligence is going to become a conscious computer that will fight against humanity like the Terminator is not the way in which artificial intelligence will harm us. The way in which it will harm us is by powerful, greedy industrialists sucking up all the minerals, the water, the land, and people's labor. That's how it's going to hurt humanity. It's not that it becomes conscious in some way.
Thank you so much. So I think we sort of now trying to heading towards the end of this webinar. Very interesting questions, and thank you so much for all the responses. Sort of evokes further discussion, and I think I wish we had more time to discuss. I want to just ask whether there is any burning issue from any of you that you would like to raise. It could be a comment. I think we've asked so many questions. I see members from the AfriTap who, AfriTap, I think, is one of those platforms that monitors. Yeah, Mamadou. So I'll come back to you, Mamadou. And any other comments, please feel free, raise your hand. We have 10 more minutes before we wrap up. Thank you. Mamadou, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jim. That was an incredible presentation that you did, and also the answer to the question. I'm really amazed. I'm not amazed because I know Jim, and then I know that this is not a surprise from my side. So I really want to thank you for this very pedagogical way of delivering such a complex issue. I know that there are many people on this actually participating to this event who they are not new to the issue, but this is very helpful for people to understand. And my suggestion will be also for our October meeting in Addis Ababa, that we put the record of this compulsory for the participants. It's a very introductory thing that people need to know, so that we will be more productive in Addis Ababa, going deeper on the action plan that we want to set up, and also all the future action that we want to do, because this is very important just to move forward in understanding what are the challenges behind for our continent, and how can we move from this passive way of looking at these technologies and active way of reacting to what is going on. One thing that I will really emphasize on is the relationship that we made between this digitalization and the energy and the climate change issue, because people don't know the quantity of energy that this is consuming, and how, because we said that the next war will be, I'm sure it's not being around water again, because there are many other things that are coming on board as fight fields. But we already said that water will be the very big problem in the future of the world, not only Africa, but also elsewhere. And Africa was a bit well located in terms of hosting some of these sources of water. If I see what is happening in Nigeria, actually, with the big data sessions and the linkage that they have on the water system that is all in some of part of Nigeria, is really scary. You look at it, and the case of, we didn't talk much about Morocco. Morocco is already on this trouble, because Morocco, there are some villages next year. It's not in 10 years. It's just 2026 that some villages will move. But at the same time, not far from these places, there are big data centers that people are trying to implement. These villages have to move next year, because there is no way, there is no water that is coming out for them for just drinking water, but also for agriculture. And the way that also this agriculture is fed in this country is caring. There is no way. People are saying it's not just a salinization issue. It's just, and even this, they are using some kind of technologies that are very harmful, because just putting out salt and putting it on the ground is more nocive again. And even the technology they are using is also very destructive of what is going on. So just to say that, thanks a lot, Jim, for raising this issue, and thanks to all, Sabrina for organizing, for facilitating the debate, but also Barbara for all the fantastic work she has been doing in preparing this. As AfriTab, I'm sure that it will be very helpful for us to prepare for the Addis Ababa. So let's put this record as a tool for preparing to the next meeting. I will stop here. I have a lot to say, but I think that from nanotechnology debate to this, because some of the things that we didn't talk too much about, that was intermediary things also. We talk about gene drive, but we didn't talk too much about nanotechnology. That has been intermediary for bringing us to this kind of hazardous technology, digitalization that is creating harm to the world. So I'll stop here. And sorry, I'm not far from you. I'm actually in Ottawa with my family, but leaving tomorrow back home. So it's a bit, yeah, thank you a lot.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mamadou, for those remarks. And coming from AfriTab, and like just helping us also understand that this thing is bigger even beyond the discussions that we've had today, and it extends to, you know, threatening many other livelihoods in different other spheres. One more person I've been asked to bring to the front to speak is Nemo. And to say a word, I've been asked by Barbara if you could also do some closing remarks, and then we will end, we'll close the webinar. Nemo, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much. Sorry you cannot see me, but I must just thank Jim for very informative presentation. I was particularly disturbed when I heard about what the implication for freshwater supply in Africa, as well as the land grab that this itself would promote. So it's really crazy. But I would like to hear a bit more about the possibility of artificial intelligence being useful for agroecology. Can that ever be contemplated? And in what sense could that happen? Thank you.
Thank you, Nemo. So Jim, do you want to respond to Nemo's last parting question before we close?
Only that I think that's a conversation the agroecology movement needs to have, and it needs to have it quite urgently, actually. I think, you know, if there are opportunities, if people are involved with either AFSA or going to Nyalini for the conversations there, or I think we need to ask this question amongst our movements: what role, if any, does digital and AI have in agroecology, and do we need to set some red lines, just like we have a red line against use of GMOs, just like we have a red line against artificial pesticides, synthetic pesticides? Do we need a red line against artificial intelligence? It's becoming quite important to answer that question.
Wonderful. So many thanks to you, Jim, for making time to do this, facilitate and present and speak. Very huge insights. I think we've all learned a lot, so many food for thoughts going forward. And thank you for kickstarting this conversation that we're going to have many other discussions stemming from. Many thanks to AfriTab and AFSA for thinking through this webinars and organizing these webinars. Barbara has already indicated that there'll be there'll be a next webinar on unpacking biodigital technologies, and this time round in Africa. So today we had a global overview, and the next will be specifically on Africa. So please do not miss, and save the date when you receive the save the date invitations. So that's all from me. I don't know if you have any last words, Jim. If not, thank you so much for all who joined, and we wish you the rest a good evening if it's evening, and just be safe and stay well. Thank you.
Yeah, we thank the interpreter, Barry, for the
yes.
fantastic work that he has been doing. So.
Thank you so much, Barry, for all the interpretation for 1.5 hours. I know it wasn't easy, but thank you for holding the fort. And yeah, thank you to all of you again. Bye-bye.
Bye.